Hey everyone, I think we're going to get started here today. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Customer Success webinar series. Today's focus is going to be on High Sierra management and security workflows. We anticipate the presentation portion to be about a half hour or so. Afterwards, we'll definitely be around to answer any questions that you have. There is a Q&A section within the web chat, or excuse me, the WebEx for providing questions to us. Please use that instead of the chat window. The Q&A will be monitored by a couple people that we have that can give us questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded for future reference, so it will definitely be available online afterward as well. Your presenters today are going to be myself, John Applebaugh. I'm a Customer Success Specialist here at Jamf.
And I'm Chris Cahoon, a Technical Support Engineer here at Jamf.
Going over briefly what we're going to cover today, we're just going to give a brief overview of the security features within macOS, particularly for High Sierra. We're then going to look at the encryption workflow using Jamf, as well as storing the recovery keys for encryption. We'll then round that discussion out by talking about a reporting features that you can use within Jamf Pro on encryption status. And then we'll end with a note around the user-approved MDM, which is a newer feature that you may not be aware of just yet. Again, this will be recorded, and there is a Q&A section that we'll be working on at the end of the presentation that's just located within the WebEx window. At any time, you can put in questions there. Diving into it, as you might be aware, security is definitely a concern, including Macs. They're no exception. The latest version of macOS from Apple builds upon the framework that exists already within macOS to provide even more features. There's a lot of different technologies out there built into the OS that you can take advantage of. Many of these have been around for several years, such as the EFI passwords, which prevents someone from booting to a disk other than the startup disk. Gatekeeper, you might be familiar with as something that locks down whether people can install applications without authorization. Things like File Vault 2 is still pretty much the standard for encrypting macOS, and is definitely something that we're going to be covering today. Newer systems, such as the System Integrity Protection, SIP, that locks down the root user, so it provides additional level of security for all of your systems. And then the newer systems in High Sierra use a new file system, the APFS, Apple File System, which is the same file system as iOS, and definitely adds an additional level of security. So as you might have read, APFS provides file encryption as part of the OS, but there is, which is really great for everyone, personal or institutional use. But File Vault is still very useful for deploying with your Macs because it allows for additional features such as the authenticated restart, as well as adding additional File Vault enabled users, and a standard process for collecting recovery keys. To use File Vault with Jamf, you'll need to have a recovery partition as well as a supported OS on the system. And of course, it will have to be enrolled within Jamf Pro in order to deploy out the encryption. Next, we're going to kind of shift a little bit into showing you how that would actually happen. There's definitely a couple of different options for you, but Chris is going to walk you through how we've seen a lot of people use Jamf Pro to encrypt computers.
Yeah, there are multiple ways to deploy encryption to computers. Today we're going to be going over the disk encryption policy method, as this provides information on the progress of the encryption process, and we've seen consistent results with it. Our first step in creating a disk encryption policy is to create our configuration. Disk encryption configurations can be found under the computer management portion of the Jamf Pro server settings. Once inside here, we'll give our configuration a display name, which will only be visible to the administrators. Then we will choose what type of recovery key we'd like to use. There are three options for recovery keys: individual, institutional, or both. Which kind of key you use is up to you and what you need for your environment. For reference, individual keys are uniquely generated for each device during encryption, and institutional keys are more of a master key for all devices that receive the encryption configuration. Once we have that chosen, we must decide whether or not we want to enable the management account or current or next user. In most scenarios, we will want to choose current or next user, This will allow the end user to unlock their machine after it has been rebooted. If we choose management account, this will be the only account initially allowed to decrypt the machine. The next step after we've created our configuration is to build the policy. If you navigate to Computers, then Policies, and click on Create New Policy. After configuring the general payload with display name frequency and triggers as desired, we can configure the disk encryption payload. Our action will be to apply disk encryption configuration, and this will allow us to choose the configuration that we just created from the dropdown. We have the option to specify when the encryption begins for the end user. Typically, we will want to select @next login for our enforcement. Having created a policy with a disk encryption payload, we then will need to determine how to deploy the policy to end users. Some things to consider are whether or not we're pushing the policy or giving the end users the option to control the process in self-service. We recommend choosing to display a start message to your end users. This provides a way to explain what is needed and what to expect in terms of logging in and rebooting. Another thing to consider is, do we want to give them the option to defer the policy? File vault encryption requires a restart, but once the encryption process starts, the end user can continue to use the computer. The process can take some time, but again, this should not hinder the end user in continuing with their tasks. The last piece of the workflow is scoping. We have to decide if we need all computers to be encrypted or if we want to use smart groups to be more targeted. Oftentimes, organizations will only encrypt their mobile computers that leave the building, like their MacBooks, and maybe leave desktops like iMacs and Mac Minis unencrypted. And I'm going to pass this back over to John. He's going to talk about storing the recovery keys.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So the Jamf Pro server can actually be used as a key storage location for all your recovery keys from encryption. Here we're talking mainly about the individual recovery key. If you use an institutional key, you would generally have that available somewhere else and then upload it to the Jamf Pro server. These automatically are stored in the Jamf Pro server during the encryption process, provided that encryption was started either through a policy or configuration profile from the Jamf Pro server. That key is then reported on an inventory record for the computer and can be used in the future to decrypt the drive. A note on security here: the database stores all those keys securely. They cannot be accessed anywhere other than through the web app. You won't be able to use API or a MySQL query to find that information. It's all securely stored within those data sources and only viewable through the web app. Like I said, most times if you're encrypting through Jamf Pro, those keys are going to be automatically stored within the Jamf Pro server. However, there might be scenarios where you might want to redirect the key or provide a means of redirecting that key to a different source or even back to the Jamf Pro server. The two scenarios that we most encounter here are either if you're directing your keys to a third-party escrow server, or if you're capturing or trying to capture keys from computers that were encrypted prior to enrollment in Jamf, or maybe your end users got anxious and started doing an encryption before you sent out a policy or configuration profile to do so. So there's a workflow that you can do to actually have the key reissued, and then this profile that we're going to show you will actually capture that key. Before High Sierra, we would use a configuration profile with the aptly named File Vault Recovery Key Redirection Payload. This basically gives you a couple different options for where you're going to send that profile. If we select the automatically redirect recovery keys to the Jamf Pro server, those send all keys, new or reissued, to the Jamf Pro server. We can also select the manual option here, which will then request a specific URL, which would be the URL of your third-party escrow server. Once you've selected your options here, you would just need to scope this profile to however many devices you need to. If it's all encrypted devices or if it's all devices in general, it's not a bad payload to have. Now with High Sierra, things have changed slightly. The functionality is pretty much the same, but it's just a different payload. We'd want to use the security and privacy payload and select the File Vault tab, and then the option here, the checkbox for Enable Escrow Personal Recovery Key. This allows us to display additional information such as maybe the contact email or details about who to contact if they need to gain access to the recovery key to unlock their drive, provided they forgot it or something like that. We can also specify a different location for the key escrow, so this would be the replacement for that manual option of a third-party server that we saw previously. You can use both of these profiles, both the file vault key redirection and the security and privacy payload, in the same environment. However, High Sierra will install both profiles, but it won't actually do anything for the file vault key redirection payload. So in that case, it's best to probably scope out your payloads based off of what type of operating system they are and use smart grouping to do so. There's lots of different built-in features of Jamf, and one that I think is very powerful and that you might want to take advantage of is being able to report on encryption status.
Yeah, the details about disk encryption status can be found in the computer records. When viewing inventory records for a computer, we can see the encryption details under disk encryption option. Follow to partition encryption status shows us the state as of the last inventory update. Individual recovery key validation and institutional recovery key validation reports whether or not the keys are present. Disk encryption configuration simply lists out what configuration was used to encrypt the computer. Further down, we can see file vault enabled to users. Retrieving the key can be done in the Management tab of a given record under the File Vault 2 section. When building our policy to deploy File Vault, we can use smart groups to scope the policy to just those devices that are not encrypted, yet using these pieces of criteria. As new devices enroll, they will fall into the smart group, and once encryption is finished, they will fall out of the smart group. Advanced searches are better when needing to report information without scoping. This could be used to report how many devices remain unencrypted. Both options have a number of pieces of criteria we can use to build off of. To build an advanced search or smart group, we choose our desired criteria. After selecting a criteria, we will need to specify an operator, is not, like, etc., and a value. We can select the 3 dot ellipses highlighted in red to get a pick list of options. For example, the criteria File Vault 2 eligibility can be used to build a smart group for sending out a policy to encrypt the drive. Here, eligible means that the device is managed, has a recovery partition, and is on a supported OS. Once we finish selecting the criteria, we can save the group or search and then click View to view the results. For reporting, we can build an advanced search using the criteria File Vault 2 partition encryption state and select boot partitions encrypted. All partitions encrypted can be used, but can lead to false negatives if external drives are attached to the computer or the system is dual booted. Additionally, we want to briefly cover the topic of File Vault 2 users. Before High Sierra, we could send a policy to add new users as File Vault users, allowing them to unlock the drive. This required that the management account be a File Vault 2 user on the computer. With High Sierra, each user is required to have a secure token. The first user to set up the device is issued a secure token automatically. At this time, the only way to generate a new local user account and obtain a secure token simultaneously is through the System Preferences GUI. Switching topics a bit, we wanted to mention some stuff about the user-approved MDM. Since it's new in High Sierra, so I'm going to pass you back to John.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've definitely covered encryption in depth, and so this is going to be a completely 180 on that, where user-approved MDM is something new to High Sierra. It was introduced starting in 10.13.2. And according to Apple documentation, the user-approved MDM will be needed to manage certain settings on Macs. This isn't explained in further detail, but I expect that there would be something else coming out. Currently, it's limited to kernel extensions for certain third-party applications. Computers enrolled through DEP or previously enrolled before upgrading to 10.13.2 will have a user-approved MDM. Jamf is working on adding additional functionality that would improve other workflows related to this, so please stay tuned and watch those feature notes or release notes as they come out. I've linked the Apple KB that talks about user-approved MDM and kernel extensions for your reference here. So you might be wondering kind of what is the impact of this new change to MDM? So as I mentioned, if they're enrolled through DEP or they are enrolled before upgrading to 10.13, that profile will be a user-approved MDM. We're really talking about machines that are enrolled after they're on 10.13.2 without DEP. In this case, the user would need to approve the MDM in order to add that additional functionality per Apple's requirement. Without user-approved MDM, right now, users would have to approve third-party applications if it wasn't installed prior to the upgrade and the application uses kernel extensions. What that would look like from an end-user perspective is they would see a profile much like this. They would have to go into System Preferences, then Profiles, and click on the MDM profile. They would then need to select the Approve button, and they'll get a notification that's a bit vague on details, so it could lead to some confusion. So this is something where you might have to have some end-user education around what to expect and how to complete this workflow at this time. So you might be wondering, will this really affect anything that you're currently doing? So kernel extensions, if you're not aware, are just modules that are loaded onto the kernel of the OS. Most are for Mac OS, but some are for third-party applications. The most prevalent examples that we can think of here are file sharing, cloud file sharing applications, antivirus, and virtualization software. There are definitely ways to find out if you're using anything that uses a .kex, which is stored throughout your operating system, but often in library/extensions. If, for whatever reason, you don't have users on a user-approved MDM, they would need to authorize those third-party kex per application. However, if they do have user-approved MDM, you can take advantage of a configuration profile that's fairly new here at Jamf, which is approved kernel extensions. You have two options here. Option one is to allow your users to approve kernel extensions, which is the default for all Macs. The other option is to specify your kernel extensions, in which case you'll need to have the team ID and bundle identifier. So this is just a way of whitelisting third-party applications that you might be deploying in the future to your enrolled devices. You can identify if you're using any kex that are not from Apple by using this simple command in terminal. Basically, it's just searching for any .kex that are not from Apple specifically. To build that configuration profile, you would need to know the team ID and bundle identifier, which are within that file itself, but they can be read via terminal with two different commands. I posted a Jamf Nation link here to a really great thread to help you identify any .kex files that you might be using, and also gives you the team ID and bundle identifier so you can easily make that whitelist for your configuration profile. So with that, we definitely have gotten to the end of our presentation, but I assume that there's going to be some questions because we covered a lot of different ground here. As you can tell, there's definitely new features within High Sierra that are there to make things more secure, but are definitely things to consider as to how you'll need to change your workflows for the future. Let us pause now, and we're just going to take some questions. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and will be available later. If you have questions or you've thought something up over the course of the webinar and you haven't posted that yet, just use the Q&A section within the WebEx room. So starting with a question from Rob Smithers, is there a file vault option to enable management account and the next user? So both.
No.
No. So it's either
the answer on that one.
Yeah.
You have to pick one or the other. It doesn't usually make sense to enable the management account first unless you have like a workflow, provisioning workflow where the admins or tech help is setting up the computer entirely before handing it off to the end user. If the computer's already in the hands of the end user, it makes the most sense to encrypt that user account.
Yeah, I'd say that one thing, like you touched on, if you have the management account as the first account, it sometimes leads to confusion, at least initially when deploying encryption, because immediately what happens is the end user can't unlock the drive. So it can sometimes lead to confusion. So current or next user is typically what we recommend in most situations. Another question, this time from Will. Can you discuss how the key is securely stored in the Jamf database, what the encryption process Jamf is using to protect the key? It's a bit sensitive. Obviously, it is hashed out, so there isn't a way to recover that key easily through other means. It's stored within the database, and like I said, it can only really be accessed through the web GUI. Take a look here. Okay, so Sarah asked, is approving the MDM profile by the end user required for every user who logs into the computer?
No, it's kind of a computer level thing because the MDM profile is computer level. That's not dependent on user level. So once it's been approved by one person, it's then in a state of approved status.
Got it. Elliot Jordan, he asked, is it possible to deploy the FileVault escrow profile payload without also forcing firewall settings on managed Macs?
Yeah, there are ways to do that. Obviously, I wouldn't say we should get too specific, but basically the profiles that you send down to computers are basically just XML files that contain keys and values as to what you're trying to set. The general workflow is basically you build the profile as you'd want it, download it, and unsign it so that you can alter it, and you'd remove the keys and values that you don't want configured. At that point, you have to re-sign it and re-upload it to the JSS. I know some of that is a little vague, but I can't really get into too many specifics there, but I definitely recommend reaching out to support. We can help you out in doing so.
Yeah, and that's a good point. There's definitely a lot of caveats to some of these workflows and specifics that are difficult to maybe explain through a general WebEx like this, but we're definitely willing to help answer those questions through support. We'll definitely be following up with any questions that we don't get to as well. Let's see here. So Tony asked, would there be any symptoms of the machine not working properly if the machine has user-approved MDM and the user has not approved the MDM? That's a really great question. It really is. At this time, and we only cover kernel extensions because that's what we know will be affected in the current iteration of High Sierra. But basically, if a user tries to open up an application that has kernel extensions and they don't have a user-approved MDM, they'll be prompted to allow an exception, basically, for those kernel extensions so it can load. So it's a bit of an inconvenience for users if you happen to use a lot of different applications that have third-party extensions, so they'd be approving every single application prior to use. So it just could lead to some annoyances and confusion, especially if they, under the impression that everything should just be seamless and silently pushed. So just to be aware of.
And I would say, too, that, what we just stated is true today, but in the future, there's likely going to be more functionality that requires the user-approved MDM state. We don't know what that is, but I would say it's likely to something come up in the future where that's also required.
Yep, yeah, and if you follow the details on user-approved MDM, there's definitely been a moving target as to when certain things are going to be enabled or be the standard. So it's just something to keep aware of, keep track of as to what Apple's releasing with High Sierra. Moving on, we have a question from Sarah. Does the MDM profile still need to be approved even after enrollment through Jamf imaging? My understanding is yes, because currently the only approved way of getting a user-approved MDM profile via enrollment is through DEP, through the Device Enrollment Program. I would just be aware of things that are changing here, both at Apple and Jamf. So just be apprised of things that might be coming down the future to help with those particular workflows. Let's see. Just a lot of different questions, so thanks for bearing with us here. So we have some questions about basically, and we touched on it only briefly, the secure tokens for High Sierra with File Vault. We didn't go into too much depth on it. We just wanted to make you aware about it. There's definitely a lot of intricacies about that we didn't go into a lot of detail, just because it does get to be a little bit more technical sometimes than what's useful for a webinar format. But basically, to add users, you want to use the method that we talked about. I would use the GUI and system preferences to add individual users, and then you can use some of those scripted ways that are out there to add the secure token for those individual users. So if we don't get to your question, or if you have questions that you think of after this webinar, definitely feel free to reach out to Jamf support or your Jamf representative to get more details. Things that we didn't get to in this webinar, we'll definitely be willing to follow up with you on. Like we said, and like just to reiterate, some of these things are still in progress. A lot of the new features of High Sierra are not set in stone just yet. So just to keep in mind that even though what we presented today is accurate for today, it may not be the same story tomorrow. So with that, I don't think we have any other questions coming through that we can get to today. So we're going to end a little bit early, but if there's anything that comes up, definitely reach out to us. Like I said, this will be a recorded webinar, and it will be available online to you. We'll definitely be following up by email as well for everyone that registered. Thanks for attending.